I had been looking forward to a quiet evening with my family. At least, that's what I told myself as I carefully adjusted the hem of my dress and walked into the softly lit dining room. The scent of roasted chicken and garlic bread filled the air, and the soft murmur of conversation echoed around the room. But the moment I stepped in, I felt it. A subtle, sharp tension slicing through the air like a knife. Grace, my daughter-in-law, was seated at the head of the table. Her posture was immaculate, her smile polite but cold, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. As soon as she noticed me, her gaze flicked sharply, lingering just long enough to make me uncomfortable. Then came the words that stopped me in my tracks. "Don't sit next to me." A wave of surprise and irritation surged through me. My instinct screamed to defend myself, to argue, to demand respect. But I didn't. I simply smiled, the kind of calm, measured smile that hides far more than it reveals. I looked around, my eyes falling on the family lawyer seated across the room, Mr. Henderson, a man whose reputation for shrewdness and subtle manipulation was legendary. Without a word, I moved my chair beside him and sat down, my back straight, my heart pounding in a rhythm that felt louder than the soft music playing in the background. The room went silent, not entirely, but enough for me to notice the quick intake of breath from my son, Theodore. He looked at me, his eyes wide, unsure, torn between loyalty and fear. I gave him a small, reassuring nod, the kind of nod that silently said, "Trust me, everything will make sense soon." The first course arrived and everyone pretended normalcy. Grace's fingers barely touched your salad as she studied me with an expression that was a cross between suspicion and irritation. I could feel the room holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The subtle glances, the suppressed smirks, the nervous coughs, they were all part of the same symphony of tension. I thought back to why we were really here. Not for dinner, not for casual conversation, but for the documents. The papers that could change everything. Inheritance, trust, and the carefully curated image Grace had built over the years. She had spent months meticulously positioning herself, presenting the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect daughter-in-law. But perfect can be a fragile mask, especially when the wrong person notices the cracks. I remembered how it all started that morning. Theodore had called me with an urgency I had never heard before. His voice had been tight, almost desperate. "Mom, you need to be careful tonight. Grace, she's not who she appears to be." At first, I thought he was overreacting. Theodore had a tendency to dramatize small family tensions. But then he dropped the line that chilled me to the bone. "She's already planning the documents. She wants control over everything. Don't let her see you coming or it'll be too late." I had spent the next hours thinking, strategizing. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, was my only ally tonight. He had promised discretion, and more importantly, he had promised influence. We had discussed this over coffee last week, laying out every scenario, every possible move Grace could make. And now it was time. The room's subtle tension began to thicken like fog. Grace's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing my proximity to Henderson. She tried to mask it with a polite smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I could almost hear her calculating, weighing her next move, trying to anticipate mine. "You look well," she said finally, her tone cold but composed. "I thank you," I replied, my voice steady, even cheerful. I leaned slightly toward Henderson, a gesture that spoke volumes to anyone paying attention. "We're ready." The appetizers came and went. We exchanged polite words. Laughter bubbled occasionally from distant corners, but it felt hollow, forced. I watched Grace carefully, noting every flicker of emotion that passed across her face. A twitch at the corner of her mouth, a tightening of her jaw, a subtle shift in her posture. She was preparing for something. I could feel it. And then it happened. Henderson reached into his briefcase under the table and pulled out a folder, thick with documents. The subtle rustle of paper caught Grace's attention instantly. Her fork froze in midair. She didn't look at me, she looked at Henderson. And in that brief moment, I saw her confidence waver just a little, enough to know that the trap was set. "Shall we begin?" Henderson said, his voice calm, almost casual, but carrying an unmistakable weight. The room went quieter. Theodore sat stiffly, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Grace's hands trembled slightly, barely noticeable, but enough for me to see. She had been so careful, so meticulous, so in control, until now. I reached for my glass, lifting it slowly. "To family," I said, my smile unwavering. "To family," Grace echoed, her voice tight, the smile on her face now completely mechanical. And then Henderson opened the folder. The papers inside were old, official, and heavy with implications. Wills, deeds, contracts, everything Grace thought she controlled. Everything she had spent months planning to claim, to manipulate, to dominate. Grace's eyes widened as she recognized the documents. She tried to mask her panic, but it was too late. The first document was placed in front of her, a paper that directly contradicted every plan she had made, every lie she had built. The room was silent now, everyone sensing the tension like a physical weight. The servers paused mid-step, unsure whether to interrupt or wait. Theodore leaned forward, eyes darting between me and Grace, fear and relief mixing on his face. Grace opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her carefully constructed image of calm, control, and superiority crumbled silently before everyone's eyes. And that's when I realized this night would not just be a dinner. It would be a turning point, not just for Grace, not just for Theodore, but for all of us. Secrets long buried were about to surface, alliances would be tested, and the family would never be the same. I leaned slightly closer to Henderson, my voice barely a whisper. "Let's see how she handles this." Grace's next move would decide everything. Would she fight, beg, cry, or would she expose herself completely, revealing the truths she had worked so hard to hide? I didn't have to wait long. Her hands trembled as she reached for the papers. Her voice, when it finally came, was sharp and brittle. This is invalid." Henderson's calm reply was devastating in its simplicity. "Everything here is verified. Every signature, every date, every clause. It's all legitimate." I watched her face drain of color, the confidence slipping away like sand through her fingers. The room felt suspended in a strange, almost surreal pause, the kind where every heartbeat echoes loudly, where every eye seems to pierce your soul. And then she did something unexpected. She stood up abruptly, chair scraping against the floor, eyes blazing not with anger, but with a calculated fury. "You think you can ruin me?" she spat, her voice rising, echoing around the room. I met her gaze calmly. "I don't think, Grace. I know." For a moment, it seemed as if time itself had stopped. The air was charged, every breath heavy with anticipation. Theodore's hand found mine under the table, squeezing tightly. Mr. Henderson leaned back slightly, observing, calculating. And Grace? Grace was a storm ready to break. And that's when the doorbell rang. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Grace froze, mid-scream, her fury interrupted. Theodore's eyes widened, and even Henderson looked momentarily startled. Who could possibly arrive at this exact moment to change everything? And more importantly, what secrets were they bringing with them? No one moved. The room held its collective breath, waiting for the next move. The sharp chime of the doorbell echoed through the dining room, cutting through the tension like a blade. Everyone froze. Even the servers stopped mid-step, glancing nervously at each other. My pulse raced. Who could it be? At a night like this, right in the middle of the most critical confrontation, only someone with purpose would dare arrive. Grace, still standing, clenched her fists so tightly that her knuckles whitened. Theodore's eyes darted toward the entrance, fear and curiosity mixing in equal measure. Mr. Henderson remained calm, but I could see the subtle shift in his posture, the brief narrowing of his eyes, a signal that he too recognized this was unexpected. The door opened slowly, revealing a figure I hadn't expected. My breath caught. It was Margaret, Grace's estranged sister, a woman with a reputation for bluntness and a sharp mind. She had disappeared from the family's life years ago, after an ugly dispute over inheritance and control. And now she stood there, tall, confident, with a mysterious envelope in her hand, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't yet name. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with amusement, "I see the party's already started without me." Grace's face turned ashen. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" she demanded, but her voice lacked the authority it usually carried. "I think you know," Margaret replied smoothly, stepping inside. "I've come to make sure the truth is finally seen, and it looks like I'm just in time." The envelope in her hand seemed ordinary, yet I could feel its weight, not just physical, but symbolic. Whoever opened it would likely reveal secrets Grace had buried so deeply that even she had started to believe in their permanence. I felt Theodore squeeze my hand under the table. His grip was tight, trembling. He whispered, almost in panic, "Mom, what is she carrying?" I whispered back, "Whatever it is, it's going to change everything. Just stay calm." Margaret approached the table slowly, deliberately, placing the envelope in front of Grace. Grace's hands shook as she looked down at it, her carefully composed image now utterly shattered. "You've been hiding," Margaret said, her voice low but sharp. "Hiding lies, hiding documents, hiding the truth. But tonight, it all comes out." Grace opened the envelope cautiously. Inside were a series of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes, evidence of manipulation, deceit, and schemes that Grace had orchestrated for months. It was undeniable proof. And the final page, folded carefully, was a will, one that contradicted everything Grace had planned. A silence fell over the room. The servers, Theodore, even Mr. Henderson, held their collective breath. Grace's face turned pale, her confidence evaporating. Her eyes darted between Margaret and me, then finally settled on Henderson, as if realizing she had underestimated him. You can't," she stammered, her voice breaking. This isn't legal." Henderson leaned forward, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Every signature has been verified. Every clause, every date. All legitimate." Grace's eyes filled with fury and desperation. You're trying to ruin me. You..." "Grace," I said firmly before she could spiral further, "this isn't about ruin. It's about truth. And tonight, the truth finally comes to light." Margaret smirked, folding her arms. "You thought you were clever, that you can manipulate everyone, control the documents, control the family. But you forgot one thing. I remember everything." The room was tense. Even Theodore, usually calm in family matters, looked unsure of what to do. Grace backed away slightly, as if trying to retreat into the past, to hide behind the carefully constructed lies she had built over the years. But there was no escaping this confrontation. Margaret continued, pulling out one last item from the envelope, a recording device. "And for the final piece," she said, "a little reminder of some conversations you had, Grace. Conversations where you planned everything, not realizing someone was listening." Grace's hand trembled. You can't..." "Oh, but I can," Margaret interrupted, "and I did." She pressed play. The voice of Grace herself filled the room, candid, unguarded, revealing plans to manipulate family members, misappropriate inheritance, and deceive Theodore. The words hit the room like a hammer. Every listener froze, absorbing the magnitude of her betrayal. I felt Theodore lean closer, covering his mouth in shock. His face was pale and his hands trembled. Grace's mask of control finally shattered completely. This isn't possible," Grace whispered, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. I didn't." Margaret's voice cut through sharply. "You did. Every word, every scheme, and now everyone sees it." I felt a strange sense of relief, not because Grace was being exposed, but because the family could finally confront the truth. The tension that had been building for months, years even, was finally breaking. And then came the final twist. Henderson, calm as ever, leaned back and opened another folder, revealing a copy of the original will that Grace had been trying to manipulate. It was clear, legally binding, and named Theodore as the rightful heir of the family estate. My son's inheritance, his rights, were finally secure. Grace collapsed into her chair, overwhelmed, her fury replaced by fear and helplessness. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her next move. This isn't possible," Grace whispered, almost to herself. "You think this ends here? You think this is over?" Margaret's smile was icy. "Oh, it's far from over, but at least now the truth is visible, and no one can ignore it." I leaned back, watching the scene unfold, feeling a mixture of triumph and disbelief. The carefully constructed web of lies, manipulation, and control was unraveling before my very eyes. The dinner table, once a symbol of harmony, had become a battlefield. Secrets long buried were now exposed, alliances were tested, and family dynamics would never be the same. And as Grace stared at the documents, at the photographs, at the recordings, I realized that this was not just the end of her schemes. It was the beginning of a new chapter for the family, a chapter where truth, finally, had the power to heal or destroy. Margaret stood, giving me a nod. "Your turn," she said softly, implying that the rest of the evening would be mine to confront Grace, to solidify the truth, and ensure that justice was served. The room was quiet, but charged. Every family member present felt the gravity of the moment. And as Grace finally broke down, sobbing openly, I felt an unexpected calm. The truth had won, but the aftermath, how Grace would respond, how the family would rebuild, how Theodore would handle the inheritance, was a story yet to be told. And that, dear reader, is the conclusion of part 2. But know this: in families where power, deceit, and control collide, one revelation can change everything. Tonight, I witnessed it firsthand.